December 16th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. Over 400,000 German soldiers move through the Ardennes forest in total silence. They do not use radios. They do not light cigarettes. Tanks crawl forward on muffled tracks through the thick snow. American radar picks up nothing. American intelligence suspects nothing. Analysts in London and Paris believe the German army is broken and incapable of a counterattack. They are wrong. By sunrise, the situation turns into a massacre. Entire American units are surrounded in the dense woods. Communication lines are severed. Supply routes are blocked. The soldiers find themselves cut off from any hope of reinforcement. The German forces strike with precision. They do not take prisoners in the initial wave. They overrun outposts and seize fuel depots. High-ranking officers flee their headquarters in panic. How did the Allies miss the signs? They had air superiority and decoded intercepts. But the Germans used the weather and strict radio silence as a shield. Chaos spreads across the front line. The footage from the following days shows abandoned jeeps and burning tanks. In the frame, frozen bodies of GIs face down in the mud. The sound of heavy artillery echoes through the valleys. There was no mistake. This was a systematic slaughter. At first glance, a quiet winter morning, but in reality, the largest ambush of the Second World War. Events accelerated. Within hours, the thin American line collapsed entirely. The Germans pushed toward the Meuse River with a single goal: to reach the sea and split the Allied forces in two. There was no turning back. Thus began the Battle of the Bulge. 1945. The German army is outnumbered and outgunned. They are running out of fuel for their vehicles and ammunition for their rifles. The war is lost. Every metric points to a total collapse. But the fighting does not stop. How did they maintain this level of resistance? American commanders analyzed the data and the results terrified them. Man for man, the German soldier was more effective than the American soldier. This wasn't about being more fanatical or more brutal. It was about professional lethality. The numbers tell the story. Even during the final defeat in Berlin, the situation was hopeless. German defenders were surrounded and doomed. Yet, in just 2 weeks, they killed over 81,000 Soviet soldiers. They destroyed nearly 2,000 tanks. The streets were filled with the smell of cordite and the sound of grinding metal. American veterans provided the testimony. These were men who fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And they all reached the same conclusion. The Germans were the hardest enemy they ever faced. Why was this the case? The answer explains why American casualties in Europe reached such high levels. It explains why battles that looked easy on a map turned into literal bloodbaths on the ground. There was no mistake. The U.S. military saw this effectiveness firsthand. After winning the war, they didn't just walk away. They adopted the German way of fighting as their own. But first, a common myth must be dismantled. Most people do not understand how soldiers are actually made. To understand why fighting Germans was so difficult, start with a specific question. When did these soldiers actually begin their training for combat? Most assume it began at the recruitment office or the enlistment center. That is incorrect. The process began at age 10. The footage from the era shows the reality. These were children being shaped into components of a military machine. Every action was calculated. Every drill was a preparation for the front lines. The training didn't start with a uniform. It started with a philosophy of total mobilization. This was only the beginning. 1934. This was the year the transformation began. German boys did not just join the Hitler Youth for summer camps or propaganda rallies. They were being forged into future soldiers. By 1937, the organization had established specialized rifle schools across the country. 1 year later, 1,500,000 boys were fully trained in marksmanship. By 1939, the process moved even further. The German High Command took direct control. General staff officers began supervising military field exercises for teenagers. These were not drills. These were rehearsals for war. Compare this to an American soldier in 1944. He is 19 years old. He has received 3 to 4 months of total training. This includes basic training, a short stint in specialty school, and immediate deployment to the front lines. But the real difference was not the duration of the drill, it was the philosophy of the training itself. The Americans focused on a rigid hierarchy. Learn your specific role, follow the chain of command, do exactly what the sergeant tells you, wait for the officer to give the word. German training was built around a darker, more practical question. What do you do when your leaders are dead? This tactical difference became a death sentence for Allied troops. The footage from the front shows the reality. An American infantry squad advances through a French village. The street is narrow. The stone is cold. Suddenly, a Maschinengewehr 42 opens fire from a second-floor window 50 yards ahead. The sound is like tearing fabric. The squad dives for cover behind a low stone wall. Dust and chips of granite fly into the air. The sergeant is pinned down with 8 men. His heart rate spikes. He does what his manual dictates. He reaches for his radio. The sergeant reports the machine gun nest. He asks for instructions. The lieutenant is 200 yards back, positioned behind a different building. He cannot see the enemy. He cannot assess the terrain. He follows his own training and radios the captain. The captain is even further away. He pulls out a paper map and spreads it across the hood of a jeep. He is looking at coordinates, not the actual combat. While the Americans talk, the Germans move. This was the flaw in the system. It was a slow mechanical process in a high-speed war. The officer studies the grid coordinates on his map. He calculates the fields of fire and makes a final decision. He will call for artillery support. It is better to rely on heavy firepower than to risk infantry casualties in a direct assault. He picks up the radio and makes the call. Artillery command acknowledges the request. Soldiers at the battery calculate firing solutions. They adjust coordinates. They load the heavy shells into the breaches. 15 minutes have passed since the first burst of machine gun fire. Now, picture a different village, a different day. A German squad advances through identical terrain. The same situation unfolds. Machine gun fire erupts from a stone building. The squad dives for cover. But the German sergeant does not reach for a radio. He's already scanning the building with his own eyes. Ground floor, second floor, then he finds the opening. A basement window is half hidden behind overgrown weeds. It is dark and undefended. He catches the eye of his 2 best soldiers. No words are spoken. He uses hand signals. You and you, around the left side, target the basement window. I will provide suppression. The 2 soldiers move immediately. There is no hesitation. They have trained for this exact scenario. The sergeant opens fire on the second-floor window. This keeps the enemy machine gun crew's attention focused forward. 30 seconds later, his 2 soldiers reach the basement window. One pulls a stick grenade. He yanks the cord, counts 2 seconds, and tosses it through the gap. The explosion is muffled by the thick stone walls. Then, silence. 3 minutes have passed since the first burst of machine gun fire. 12 minutes. That is the exact time difference between waiting for permission and acting on initiative. It is the gap between following a rigid chain of command and trusting a sergeant to make a tactical call. This gap was devastating. The 12-minute delay did not happen just once. It occurred in every firefight, every ambush, and every unexpected contact across the front. Those minutes accumulated. They turned into mounting casualties. American soldiers waited for orders while German squads were already flanking, already repositioning, and already attacking. American commanders saw the pattern in after-action reports. German units with fewer men were holding ground against much larger American forces. German squads were reacting faster and adapting to the chaos of combat quicker. At first, the Americans did not understand why, but the data was clear. Speed on the ground was more lethal than heavy guns in the rear. The war was being won and lost in those 12 minutes. Then, the truth came out. This was not a simple gap in training. It was something deeper. The German army followed a philosophy of warfare refined over many generations. They called it Auftragstaktik, mission command. Once the meaning of that word is clear, German effectiveness becomes logical. American officers gave specific orders on how to fight. German officers told their soldiers what to achieve. The difference seems minor on paper. In the chaos of combat, it was everything. But the system had a fatal requirement. It only works if the soldiers are already professionals before they reach the front lines. By 1944, the men defending France were not just trained troops, they were survivors of the most brutal battlefield in history, the Eastern Front. More people died in the East than in every other theater of World War II combined. The numbers are staggering. These were soldiers who survived Stalingrad and the tank battles at Kursk. They endured Soviet offensives that attacked in endless waves, overwhelming positions through sheer mass. The footage shows the reality of winter combat. Frostbite killed as many men as bullets. Tanks froze into solid blocks of steel, rifles jammed from the ice inside the mechanisms. These men knew how to fight when everything went wrong. On the Eastern Front, failure was the daily routine. Contrast this with the American soldier landing at Normandy. He had never been shot at. He had never seen a man die in front of him. For many, June 6th was their first day of war, but American intelligence officers noticed something shocking in the battle reports. German effectiveness did not drop when the tide turned against them. In their final battles, even when surrounded and doomed, their lethality increased. Why did they keep fighting? At first glance, it looks like fanatical loyalty. In reality, it was the result of a hardened combat culture. Two specific examples prove this. April 16, 1945. Berlin. The Red Army tightens the noose. They deploy 2,500,000 soldiers. They bring 6,250 tanks. They line up 41,600 artillery pieces. Facing them are the German defenders, roughly 100,000 men. Most are elderly militia or teenage Hitler youth. They have no air support. No reinforcements are coming. There is zero chance of survival. Everyone in the city knew the war was over. Hitler would be dead within weeks. Germany would surrender within days. So why fight? The records show the cost. In 2 weeks of desperate street fighting, those doomed German defenders killed 81,116 Soviet soldiers. They destroyed 1,997 Soviet tanks. That is the German army defined by a single statistic. They were losing the war while winning individual battles. Berlin shows tactical skill in the face of total defeat. But Ternopil shows something darker. What happens when professional skill is wasted by strategic stupidity? March 1944. Ternopil, Ukraine. Hitler declares the city a fortress. He orders 4,600 German soldiers to hold it at all costs. The first commander arrives. He walks the perimeter and assesses the situation. He sends a message directly to Hitler. The position is hopeless. Hitler fires him immediately. The replacement commander takes over. He tries to execute the order anyway. For 1 month, those 4,600 soldiers hold their ground against overwhelming Soviet forces. The footage from the era shows ruins. Smoke rises from every cellar. When the battle finally ends, 4,545 men are dead or wounded. Only 55 soldiers escape the perimeter. That is a 99% casualty rate. German soldiers were professionals, but Hitler's strategic insanity turned that skill into a death sentence. There was no turning back. Training and experience only explain half the story. The weapons they carried made the other half. There is a myth about those weapons. It needs to be destroyed. The focus falls on Hitler's Buzzsaw, the MG-42. This was the primary German machine gun. It fired 1,200 rounds per minute. At that speed, the human ear cannot distinguish individual shots. It sounds like a continuous mechanical buzzing. Compare that to the American bar. It fired 500 to 600 rounds per minute. The MG-42 fired twice as fast. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering. But reality was different. 1,200 rounds per minute. That was the fire rate of the German MG-42. This single machine gun dictated the entire structure of the German infantry squad. In their doctrine, every rifleman existed only to support the gunner. They carried his spare barrels. They hauled his ammunition boxes. They provided security while he reloaded. The Americans worked differently. Their squads were built around the individual rifleman. The Browning automatic rifle served only as a support tool for the men with M1 Garands. On the battlefield, the math was brutal. One German sergeant with an MG-42 produced more lead than 12 American soldiers combined. This firepower allowed small German units to stall entire companies. But the machine gun isn't the weapon people focus on. The conversation always shifts to the tanks, specifically the heavy armor. You have heard the statistic. It took 5 Shermans to take down a single Tiger. The data says otherwise. This myth originates from one primary source, Death Traps by Belton Cooper. Modern historians categorize this book as unreliable. It is a collection of anecdotes, not a statistical analysis. Look at the 1946 U.S. Army study. Researchers analyzed 30 separate tank-on-tank engagements involving Shermans and Panthers. The results were clear. The Sherman achieved a kill ratio of 3.6 to 1. The Americans were winning, not just surviving. British after-action reports confirm this trend. Across all tracked engagements, Allied forces inflicted 1.3 casualties for every Sherman lost. The footage shows the reality. The Sherman had a faster turret traverse. It had better optics. It was reliable. In a frontal engagement at 1,000 yards, the Tiger held the advantage. But American crews did not play by those rules. They used smoke. They used flanking maneuvers. They called in P-47 Thunderbolts for airstrikes. They used specialized tank destroyers like the M36. They fought smart, not fair. There's a critical fact everyone ignores. Tigers were rare. Most German crews operated the Panzer IV. Against this tank, the Sherman fought on equal ground. The image of helpless American steel is a fabrication. The real advantage was industrial. For every single Tiger that left the factory in Germany, the United States produced 10 Shermans. The Americans had better logistics, superior production, and overwhelming numbers. Yet, the casualty rates remained staggering. Thousands of American soldiers died in the hedgerows of France and the forests of Germany. If the equipment was superior, why were the losses so high? It came down to the nature of the defense of 1945. American abundance created a hidden weakness. This was the paradox of the Western Front. The United States possessed the most efficient logistics system in military history. When a unit requested artillery, hundreds of heavy guns opened fire. Air support arrived in full squadrons. If a tank was destroyed, a replacement arrived at the front lines within 48 hours. The German army had none of these advantages. Their divisions were undersupplied. They lacked fuel. They ran out of ammunition. But this superior logistics system made American units slower. They were heavy. They were methodical. German units traveled light and moved fast. American units waited for the supply chain. They established depots, secured roads, and consolidated positions. While the Americans were busy bringing up fuel trucks and rations, the Germans retreated, regrouped, and launched counterattacks. In the long run, American industrial firepower won the war. But in individual battles, German speed killed. The Battle of the Bulge began in December 1944. Germany committed nearly 500,000 men to the offensive. By the end, they lost over 100,000 soldiers. For Berlin, these losses were final. For Washington, it was a different calculation. Replacements were already crossing the Atlantic in massive troop ships. But there was a cost to this war that no one expected. It was a psychological burden. January 1945. Records show this was the coldest January ever recorded in Western Europe. The temperature dropped below zero. Snow piled high in the Ardennes forest. The footage shows soldiers shivering in foxholes. Their boots were soaked. Their fingers were frozen. At this moment, a new threat emerged. American soldiers were not just dying from German bullets. They were dying from the environment and the failures of their own equipment. In the 19th century, armies died of disease. In the 20th century, they died of the cold. The American army was now fighting two enemies, the Wehrmacht and the winter. One was retreating. The other was just beginning to kill. 23,000 casualties in 60 days. That was the price of the cold before a single bullet was fired. American soldiers were not just fighting Germans, they were fighting the climate. Rain soaked the foxholes. Temperatures dropped below zero. Boots stayed wet for weeks. The result was trench foot. First, the skin turns white, then it turns black. The flesh rots while the soldier is still standing. Doctors performed hundreds of amputations in field hospitals. This was a battle against biology. The Germans were prepared. They had spent 3 years fighting winners on the Eastern Front and knew the prevention protocols. Americans were forced to learn these lessons through infection and bone saws. But the physical pain was only half of the burden. There was a psychological cost to this specific war. Many American soldiers had German last names. They had German parents or grandparents. They shared the same ancestry as the men they were shooting at. A veteran later described the internal conflict. He noted that the prisoners looked like his own family members. You would capture a German soldier and see your uncle's face. It made pulling the trigger difficult. Everything changed on December 17, 1944. Any remaining sympathy evaporated in a field near Malmedy, Belgium. SS troops under the command of Joachim Peiper captured 84 American soldiers. These were prisoners of war. The SS lined them up in the snow and opened fire with machine guns. The footage from the aftermath shows the bodies frozen in the mud. This was the turning point. These were not Wehrmacht professionals who followed the rules of engagement. These were SS ideological troops. They were murderers in uniform. After Malmedy, every American soldier understood the distinction. The war became personal. If German soldiers were more effective man for man, why did they lose? The answer lies in the leadership. Adolf Hitler's strategic insanity wasted his best divisions. He ordered the defense of fortress cities like Ternopil. He demanded the Ardennes offensive. These were tactical gambles that squandered his remaining strength. Then, there was the factor of logistics. American industrial power reached peak production rates. One Liberty ship launched every day. One bomber rolled off the assembly line every hour from a single factory. The numbers were absolute. America could replace every lost tank and every fallen soldier. Germany could not. Every German casualty was irreplaceable. The German soldier was tactically brilliant, but he was abandoned by his own high command. The war of attrition was over before it began. Thus ended the myth of German invincibility. 1945. The war ended, but the respect remained. American soldiers who faced the Wehrmacht on the front lines didn't see monsters or ideological shells. They saw professionals. Among the infantry, a saying took root: you hadn't truly been in a war until you fought the Germans. The battlefield was the first classroom. After the surrender, the study began. American officers didn't just archive German records, they deconstructed them. They looked at Auftragstaktik, or mission-oriented command. It was a system where a commander gave a goal, not a list of steps. The officer told his men what to do, but let them decide how to do it. The modern United States military operates on these exact principles today. You see it in every field manual. Decentralized command, mission-type orders, the initiative of the non-commissioned officer. The German army collapsed in the field, but their tactical DNA survived. It moved from the losers to the victors, influencing global military doctrine for the next 80 years. Why were German soldiers more effective in small unit combat? There were 3 reasons. First, rigorous training. Second, a doctrine that encouraged independent thinking at the lowest levels. Third, years of continuous combat experience on multiple fronts. They were a specialized tool built for one purpose: tactical victory. But tactics do not win world wars. The United States possessed more soldiers, superior logistics, and a clear strategic vision. American industry produced tanks and planes faster than Germany could destroy them. In the end, quality lost to quantity. Yet the quality of the individual German unit was a physical reality, not a post-war fabrication. Veterans who survived the hedgerows of Normandy or the snow of the Ardennes never forgot the efficiency of the men across the line. At first glance, they were just the enemy, but in reality, they became the blueprint for the modern soldier. There was no mistake in the data. The numbers show a higher kill-to-loss ratio for German units throughout most of the conflict. But does this data tell the whole story? Or is this simply a case of history romanticizing the losing side because of their aesthetic and gear? How did the Germans maintain this edge while their country was being firebombed? It came down to the grit of the individual squad. But even the best squad cannot stop a 1,000-bomber raid. Here's the question. Knowing that the 5 Shermans to 1 Tiger myth is false, and looking at the raw combat data, do you believe the German soldier was objectively better? Or are we just looking at the past through a distorted lens? Write your answer in the comments. This debate needs data, not emotions. If this analysis changed your perspective on the reality of the European theater, hit the like button. Subscribe for more reports that dismantle myths and focus on the mechanics of history. The files remain open.